So, Dan, when I say Cherokee, what does that make you think of?
Mr. Harold.
Ooh, okay, great.
You want one?
Give it.
Pabst Blue Ribbon.
It's going to make me think of the Lemp Mausoleum.
Okay.
And how about we go for Green Tree? What is that? Invoke
that's
in
the
you?
Fernbachers all day long.
Right.
And even a Mr. Schlossstein with 3 S's.
A good Irish name right there.
So how about we take it up a notch and we talk about the king of beers?
The king of beer himself, which I am a huge fan of. That's Mr. Adolphus Busch. All beer barons. And that's what we're covering today.
All right. I'm thirsty already.
Oh, it is that time.
It's not Miller time.
No, it's not. Not in St. Louis.
This is the Can You Dig It podcast. We crawl into the crypts, gardens, and forgotten cemeteries. Join Dan Fuller, your resident cemetery chronicler, and Joe Shields, the plot-loving development exec, as we unearth the dark secrets of St. Louis and Bellefontaine Cemetery and beyond. From garden geeks to history buffs with a taste for the macabre, as well as fans of iconography. This is your podcast. We love diving deep into the shadows of history. Let's dig in.
So today we're going to talk about beer barons and their impact on the city of St. Louis, their contributions to the city of St. Louis, and how St. Louis became a beer town. It's an incredible story. Dan, as you well know,
Right.
St. Louis excelled at 4 industries in the 19th and 20th centuries. And when I say excel, I mean leaders on a national and sometimes global scale. So if you take a look at production of beer, that's 1. Production of shoes, that's number 2. Production and manufacturing of tobacco, that's number 3. And then, oddly enough, caskets and coffins. St. Louis led those industries at one point in the 19th and early 20th centuries. So beer in St. Louis, it's synonymous. Just as synonymous as the gateway to the West, St. Louis is a beer town.
Right. And who wants to talk about coffins and tobacco when you got beer to talk about? So,
Right.
A lot of people don't realize the Germans come here because of a book written by a man named Duden. And he basically identifies the Missouri River Valley as a place that is much like their home of Germany. And when the Germans come here, they bring the taste for lager beer. But unfortunately, there wasn't really a lot of lager beer here in St. Louis because we had more French, Spanish, and English heritage. And so it was porters and ales. And it's Adam Lemp, who pre-Civil War, who brought the first lager beer to St. Louis. And I always associate the Lemps with the first brewing dynasty that we have here. Some other people know more readily will come a little bit later. But Adam Lemp is the one who really wets the whistle of the Germans that are here.
And what a story. For Adam Lemp to be the first person to bring lager beer to the U.S., the first person to brew lager beer in the St. Louis region, and then set up a dynasty, the Lemp family dynasty. Lemp beer was huge. At one point, they'd eclipsed Anheuser-Busch as probably the most well-known, recognized beer name coming out of St. Louis is Anheuser-Busch. But there's many dynasties. And it all starts in 1809. The first registered brewery in the city of St. Louis was by John Coons in 1809. It was a small brewery, only lasted a few years, but that was what ignited what would become just an immense amount of local smaller breweries and I would say at least a dozen large breweries.
Right. And St. Louis is always going to be a beer town, and it does take 3 things. Early in our history, it's going to take caves. Because to lager beer, you have to rest it, and it has to be at a particular temperature. And we have this plethora of water right outside our door. We can cut the ice. We put it into a cave along with sawdust, and we create these lagering cellars. So the caves are important. The water is important. You don't want to drink our water until it's been brewed. And so that is a plus as well here in St. Louis. And the last thing is the Germans. And what I always like to point out to people is pre-1880, everything we're brewing in St. Louis, we're drinking in St. Louis. It really doesn't come until after the 1880s, 1890s that we start pushing our brews outside of our city limits. And if you went to go have a beer, you'd go to street interchange, and there could be 4 taverns on each of the 4 corners. And each of those taverns was owned by one of the big breweries. So you could go to a Green Tree Brewery product brought to us by the Fernbachers, or you could go to, you mentioned Coons before, that'll come along a little bit later, but our friends the Lemps definitely had theirs. And you really didn't buy a particular brand of beer, that won't come until later, but it would be Lemp Tip Top and Lemp Lager, Falstaff, and all those kind of things will come about a little bit later in around those Prohibition years. So caves are incredibly important here in St. Louis for the lagering of beer, but also to get away from the heat. One of my favorite families as far as beer and beating the heat is the Urics, who had an early brewery, did fairly well for themselves, but their lagering cellar would continue to be hollowed out and would become Uric's Cave and would become a destination for theatrical performances, speeches, the whole 9 yards, and that was a way to beat the heat. Today, our cave system, Cherokee Cave, gone the way of the dodo bird, and we don't hear much about that except that maybe some of our sewers run through the old cave systems.
You know, in 1810, you could buy a barrel of Jacques St. Varen's Bellefontaine Brewery for $10. A barrel of beer for $10. It's amazing.
Well, somebody who would jump in on that a little bit, very synonymous with us and Bellefontaine Cemetery, is Edward Hempstead. Edward was known to be somebody who kind of dealt in beer. He had some from St. Vain, and if you needed to settle maybe some kind of a debt with him, he might take some produce or some livestock from you, and if he owed you some change, he'd probably give it to you in some of the St. Vrain beer.
So the Germans come to St. Louis in large numbers, and they changed and transformed the landscape of the city of St. Louis to, at one point, I believe 1 out of every 3 St. Louisan was a native speaker of German. And the contributions that the German population would bring with them, as far as of course, they enhanced the culture of St. Louis, and of course, as we already said, they brought beer with them. So, Dan, what do you think is the biggest contribution? Let's start big. What is the biggest contribution that a brewer has brought to St. Louis, or added to St. Louis?
Well, we have to go back to the Lemps. And we'll get to that other guy a little bit later, but William Lemp is the first one who used an airplane to deliver beer. He's the first one who used artificial or man-made refrigeration. And that's a big game changer, because before that we were hunkered down by the ice, and if you had ice in your houses. And now with man-made refrigeration, he can ship that out. And he is working on pushing his boundaries outside the city of St. Louis. He took his father's legacy, Adam Lemp, moved it from what would be basically the south leg of the arch over the Cherokee Cave system, because he was cutting down on his shipping charges going back and forth to those lagering cellars. And then he builds that state-of-the-art facility, only unfortunately to see that go away by his son's hand, Billy, who will sell that facility to the International Shoe Company. And that's why it says that on that brewery even still to this day. So it's still there. Somebody could crank it up maybe, but it's not brewing beer like it used to.
Another contribution that I just love driving around the south side is the architecture. The architecture of what's left behind of the Lemp Brewery. The Anheuser-Busch Brewery on Pestalozzi. At Christmas time, that's lit up like you just wouldn't believe. It's actually a tourist destination. And as I said earlier, I'm a huge fan of Adolphus Busch. I love how Adolphus wasn't a prolific brewer, but he was an incredible businessman.
Right. So you brought in the big guys.
I brought in the big guys.
So what we have to do now is kind of back up just a little bit, because without Eberhard Anheuser, the soap king of St. Louis, there would not be a Bavarian brewery that will then become Anheuser-Busch.
Yes, and something I want to touch on now, which we're going to probably get into in just a few minutes, is the entrepreneurial spirit of the German population that came over. Because, like Dan, that was a perfect segue. We have all these prolific brewers that come over here, but they came over here with pretty much nothing. So Eberhard Anheuser was the soap king of St. Louis, and he would, by chance, come into the Bavarian brewery. We'll get into that in a minute. Other brewers would make money, fast forwarding for a second through Prohibition. They would make money in other ways. And then on the other side of Prohibition, they survived only because they were entrepreneurs and they hustled in other industries.
Well, nobody hustled more than Adolphus. One of the things most overlooked is he and somebody who's a fringe beer baron, Tony Faust, attended the Paris Exposition when the Eiffel Tower was debuted, and they would see Rudolf Diesel's new creation. Tony Faust bought the first diesel engine, and the first electrically lit establishment in St. Louis is Tony Faust Oyster Bar, which, by the way, served Faust beer brewed by his in-laws, Adolphus Busch. And Adolphus Busch, never to be put to the side, actually bought the rights from Rudolf Diesel to produce diesel engines in America. And so for a period of time, there was the Busch Seltzer diesel engine factory here in St. Louis in the shadow of Anheuser-Busch.
Building our first diesel engines for the United States Navy for our submarines for World War I.
L-class submarines. Every L-class submarine in the United States Navy during World War I was powered by a Busch Seltzer diesel engine.
So Adolphus Busch, the businessman, marries Lily Anheuser-Busch, and that's the connection to the Anheuser family. So Adolphus, like Dan, you just said, builds the first diesel engines for the United States Navy for our submarines of World War I. But backing that up just a decade, the 1904 World's Fair. Not only is he a director, one of the many directors of the World's Fair, but the Busch Bottle Works at the fair was a feat in itself.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I have to mention this because on my tours at the cemetery, it never fails to stun people that Adolphus Busch did not care for beer.
Yeah. Well, we're going back to Faust's Oyster House, where Tony Faust loved to play the game where he'd pull out 1, 2, 5, 12 different types of variety of wine, and without letting Adolphus see the label, pour a little for a taste, and Adolphus would taste it, and 95% of the time he could tell you what vineyard it was. And if you come to the Busch Mausoleum here, you'll see grapes. Grapes are repeated iconography on the Busch Mausoleum, identifying the fact that though they made their money in brewing beer, they, especially with Adolphus, preferred a sweet white Riesling.
Becoming the king of beer, helping to propel your brewery to gain prominence globally in beer sales, and everything else that you've accomplished in the beer industry, not liking beer and referring to it as das Slop. I would say 75% of all people that I tour at the cemetery, their faces light up. It's an uncanny coincidence.
Yeah, but I come back to the whole fact, and I will quiz people on this all the time, not every manufacturer uses the goods that they make. So, again, some might say, well, you know, this is sacred, this is beer. Well, I got news for you. It was a way of making money. One of the things that we didn't talk about is that Adolphus Busch was 21 out of 22 kids. He came from a very affluent family over in Germany, and he knew he would not, as I used to say, receive much off the buffet line. And so he'd come to Missouri, basically, chasing one of his older brothers who already had a Busch brewery out in Washington, Missouri. But he didn't like the smaller towns, so he came back here into St. Louis and was a brewery supplier, and that's how he makes that connection to Eberhard. So it's not just the fact that brewing beer was one of those kind of things in his arsenal, but he ends up in St. Louis and has the big impact here because he didn't like the little towns. He wanted the big city. He wanted, you know, all the things that come with the big city trappings. So basically, we're kind of popping all over the place with brewers, and we've really glossed over one of the most important ones, one of the third largest brewing families in St. Louis with the Wainwrights. And when we come back, we'll talk about how he really impacted the city of St. Louis.
In today's fast-paced digital world, where every message competes for attention, how do you ensure your voice stands out above the noise?
Introducing EG Media Group, your ultimate destination for cutting-edge content creation. Our expert team specializes in crafting captivating videos and engaging podcasts that leave a lasting impression on your audience. Wow! But we're more than just content creators. Are you an aspiring author? Let EG Media Group be your guide through the publishing process, from editing to cover design. Imagine your manuscript transformed into a masterpiece, ready to connect with readers around the world. Don't just write your book. Launch it strategically with EG Media Group as your partner in author success. Visit egmediagroup.com today for a free consultation and turn your dream into reality. That's egmediagroup.com. EG Media Group. Create,
connect,
convert.
So Joseph Wainwright, born in England, comes to the United States early 19th century, and he lands in Pittsburgh. And he starts the Wainwright Brewery. He would have 9 kids. 2 of them would come to St. Louis. Samuel and one of his other brothers.
Ellis.
So Samuel and Ellis, 2 of Joseph's children, come to St. Louis to start their own fortune, to make their own way. And they start the Fulton Brewery in St. Louis. And I'm going to treetop this because it gets very in-depth with different business partners, member of the Busch family. Long story short, through a series of mergers and acquisitions, Ellis Wainwright, which would be Samuel's only son, inherits his share of what would be, by this time, the Wainwright Brewery. And he buys out the other business partners. So now Ellis Wainwright is the sole proprietor of the Wainwright Brewery. You're in the mid to late 19th century now. And the Wainwright Brewery was huge. And what set them apart from the majority of other brewers in St. Louis was he was English. He was not German. And Wainwright Ale was a very popular product. So Ellis Wainwright marries Charlotte Dixon Wainwright. Never had any children. And the reason I bring that up is that's going to be part of the Wainwright story here in a second. Fast forwarding to the later 19th century, Ellis Wainwright would sell to a European conglomerate called the St. Louis Brewers Association, the SLBA.
And that's the first time the Belgians and the English came to town. So this whole stuff with Anheuser-Busch and InBev is kind of second nature here in St. Louis. We're kind of like a little engine. We have these entities that pop up and they're conglomerated together. And this was an attempt back there with the SLBA to kind of try and compete against the big two. The big two at that time was at number 2, Anheuser-Busch, and number 1, the Lemp by production. So this was a way for Ellis to kind of deal with the big boys a little bit because he could never seem to get by them. So, there's a lot of lore about how well they got along. But I will tell you, back to what Joe was talking about with Charlotte Wainwright, when Charlotte Wainwright died, she's on a European trip with her good friend Lily Anheuser-Busch. So I think it goes back to that whole Abraham Lincoln thing about keep your friends close and your enemies even closer. What better way to keep up with what the newest things going on at the rival brewery than, maybe having a glass of wine with Adolphus Busch.
So I'm going to talk about beer brewing and specifically about Bellefontaine Cemetery and how we have over 100 brewers here at the cemetery in Prospect Street. So Prospect Street, for everybody out there, is loosely referred to as Millionaire's Row because of all the notable people buried from one end of the street to the other. And it's been loosely referred to that for generations. So you have the Wainwright family directly interred across from the Lemp family. And they both have mausoleums. Well, Prospect Street is 90% mausoleums. Then as you go down the street, next you're going to hit Anheuser. Eberhard Anheuser.
Ebby
Anheuser. He would be the grandson of the Eberhard Anheuser, who would join the brewery at the very late 19th century, but he would become a force of nature.
Yeah. His biggest force, actually, interestingly enough, and the irony of it, because we were fighting the Germans in World War I, he was the biggest Liberty Bond producer in America. So he's helping fight his ancestors to a certain extent from that standpoint.
Joining the brewery in 1896, and he would retire in 1956, and he would start off as a shipping clerk, and then he would go to the real estate maintenance department, and then he went into national advertising, and then he received an appointment to an executive level position, and then he would just go up from there, and he retired as one of the board of directors. And so as you leave the Anheuser Mausoleum, right next door is the Noker Mausoleum, another one of our beer barons.
Yep. Now, this is where we got to dial back just a little bit because most importantly is the term brewster. And that's where we get into a female who knows the art and craft of brewing beer. And that really starts with Frederica Brinkworth, who happens to be buried next door at our friends at Calvary. They're part of the Archdiocese. And their daughter, Louisa, will hook up with our friend Noker, who really isn't a brewer. He's more of a financier. He's got a banking background. And so he'll become much of the, I always like to call them bean counters at the brewery. But the Greasy Deck Brinkworth Noker Brewery, which will eventually, they'll jettison the Greasy Decks, and they'll move forward. This is where we still have some legacy from brewing, and the Archbishop's house is the original Noker mansion. So if you go by there and you're saying hi to the Archdiocese and the Archbishop, you're really paying some homage to the Nokers. And another one of those beer baron families, that's one of those remnants.
So let's talk about the Greasy Decks. Because in my opinion, if you had to pick a family or an operation that had the most widespread impact on brewing beer in St. Louis, Dan, would you agree that the Greasy Deck family would just be right up there, if not up there? Because they're in and out. Yeah. They're in and out of different
but what I want to
companies.
Identify again is we have that multi-generational thing here. We have the multi-generation with the Lemps. We have it with the Anheisers, and the Greasy Decks are the most important. And we start off with Anton, Frank, and Henry. And they're really not brewers. They are brewery suppliers. And it was easier to talk about what breweries they didn't have their hand in than the ones they did, because they were in so many different pockets. But it's Papa Joe who comes along during the Prohibition time, and he was one of those people like Adolphus Busch who knew Prohibition was not going to last forever, and he's going to take full advantage. And so he will gobble up brewery after brewery, the Union Brewery, anything that comes up for sale, he'll basically get, with the sheer idea that this is going to be his platform to reignite beer. And most people think that Anheuser-Busch products are the first one presented to Roosevelt after Prohibition, and it's actually Falstaff is already on the kitchen table for Roosevelt's pleasure when Anheuser-Busch is chugging up the street with the Clydesdales. So,
And, you know, what an iconic picture is the Clydesdales, you know, on opening day at Busch Stadium for the Cardinals. The Clydesdales delivering beer to Roosevelt right after Prohibition ended. And I believe that was the first time the Clydesdales made a public appearance, wasn't it?
Yeah,
when they were in D.C.?
I think so.
In the 30s?
But many of the brewers had draft horses. I mean, again, here's where we forget about the Lemps used Percherons. And so it's not a novel idea, but our friends at Anheuser-Busch are the ones who kind of take it to the zenith. And of course, it's that trademark. And like you said, invoking the emotion. I don't think there's a St. Louisan who does not get on their feet when the Clydesdales hit the field at Busch Stadium.
And playing Here Comes the King. I mean, there's nothing more St. Louis. We talked about in a prior episode, that's so St. Louis. That is St. Louis, is hearing Here Comes the King and singing the Clydesdales.
So one of the things that Joe said that I can't agree more with is the fact that Adolphus Busch really knew how to kind of work it. He was the businessman's businessman, and he, you know, coveted a few things. And one of the things that he coveted was from a particular brewer who doesn't happen to be with us here at Bellefontaine, but is down at New St. Marcus. And his name was Obert. And he had this wonderful logo with this big O and an eagle flying through it. And I kind of envisioned that our friend Adolphus Busch always kind of coveted that. And when we're getting into this period that Prohibition is blowing in the winds and people are starting to liquidate, they don't have legacies, so they're going to take their money and go retire. It's Adolphus Busch who secures the old Obert logo, and out with the O and in with the A. And, you know, Adolphus did that a couple of times.
So I have to say, full disclosure, I am a fan of lager. I love lager beer. I love everything about it. And my favorite lager beer, and I'm not just saying this because I'm a native St. Louisan, but it's Budweiser, or what the kids call Bud Heavy. I don't understand that, but old school, regular Budweiser with the red label, to me, is perfection. And I love how the story of Budweiser doesn't really have much to do, or I should say the origination of it, with Adolphus Busch.
Correct.
It's Carl Conrad, who is a resident of Bellefontaine Cemetery, and he has a very modest lot on the western side of the cemetery. And it's a chance meeting between Carl Conrad and Adolphus Busch is why we have the beer of kings, Budweiser, in the United States. So Carl Conrad is an immigrant, comes to the United States, and he starts Carl Conrad and Company, importers. He imported liqueurs and wines. And this is where we point towards Adolphus. Tony Faust had Tony Faust Oyster House in the city, and it was the Delmonico of the West. It was the most ritziest restaurant outside of New York, which was Delmonico's, which was the most ritziest restaurant out there. So Tony Faust's supplier is Carl Conrad, and he would introduce, Tony Faust would put together Carl Conrad and Adolphus Busch. Adolphus loved a cool glass of German Riesling every day for lunch. So the two became friends. And Carl Conrad would go back to Europe.
With Adolphus.
Yeah, and they sampled a lager in Europe when they were over there together in the town of Budweis. Well, Carl Conrad brought the recipe back with him. And then he made a business partnership with Adolphus, because Adolphus had the brewing capacity, but yet Carl Conrad had the recipe. And they would join forces, go on a national tour, and it was a huge hit. And that's how we get Budweiser in the United States.
One of my favorite things to display, and this is where, you know, you have to use your imagination, is we have through some of our friends in the patent office here in St. Louis, one of the original Budweiser labels that doesn't say Anheuser-Busch, it says Carl Conrad and Company. And other than that subtle change, you really don't notice much difference.
It's amazing. I hope that someday that is made public, because I've had the pleasure of seeing it, and it will really make your hair on your head stand up. How just perfect of a rendition it is, hand-drawn.
Yep. And again, going back to what we were saying, Adolphus is kind of, and he was so loved by his employees too. He was the businessman's businessman. He didn't have the problems that titans of that time had with labor positions, because people loved him and his work and the way he took care of his people. And that carried through up until our friends at InBev came in. And I know that the culture at Anheuser-Busch is a little bit of what it was, but not what it was under the reigns of the Busch family. And this is where I do want to point out that, Adolphus Busch is with us. One of his daughters, who married into the Faust family, connecting that, is with us. But the majority of the Busches are actually at Sunset Cemetery in South St. Louis. We pretty much have every Anheuser that's ever been born here at Bellefontaine, but a majority of the Busches are actually down south, just candy corner from Grant's farm. So the original aristocracy of St. Louis is French, and then people forget about the Spanish. And when the Germans come to town in that 1820s, 30s, 40s, they're not very well received. And so it is said that when Adolphus Busch tried to join St. Louis Country Club, he was shunned. And so he will create Sunset for he and his German friends. Another example of that is one of the finest places to live was Vandevander Place at this particular point. And that was a particular enclave for the French, Spanish, and original aristocracy of St. Louis. And so then you end up with Compton Heights, where most of the Germans would basically put a home. And that's where the Greasy Ducks were, and that's where many of the other Germans happened to be. Adolphus Busch, he had his number one Busch place there on the grounds of what is the brewery today. And then down the line, Grant's farm would come into play, and that's that nice little shot right down the Gravois, as we like to say, or Gravois for you in here in St. Louis.
So what an industry. I'm going to take you back again to 1809. That's when the first registered brewery comes along. By 1840, you have Adam Lemp, who brings the first lager beer to the United States and the city of St. Louis. By 1840, there's 40 breweries in St. Louis operating successfully, producing over 212,000 barrels of beer a year. And if you think about how that progressed through the golden era, which is 1890 to 1910, where Anheuser-Busch becomes the largest brewer in the world, think of all the ancillary economic downstream effect, all the jobs, whether you're freight, railroad, shipping, any brewery supplies, the coopers for the barrels, just all the money and investment that this created for the city of St. Louis. I would say it's mission critical to the success of the city as we know it today.
So, see, Joe goes to all those details. I break it down into that in this time period we're first in booze, first in shoes, and last in the American League.
Which is another episode that we will talk about soon. So if you found the information today interesting, please know that we have just cracked the bottle open on all of this detailed information. Bellefontaine Cemetery and Arboretum is home to over 100 of these magnificent men and women who pioneered this industry, who had a national and global impact. And we invite you to come to Bellefontaine Cemetery and Arboretum to attend one of our tours, attend one of our beer events, and of course check out the website, because these tours and events happen throughout the year.
All right. It's one thing to hear it, but then to hear it maybe in the shadow of that Adolphus Busch mausoleum, or in the shadow of the Lemp mausoleum, or the Wainwright mausoleum. And you're hearing, of course, a thread here, a lot of mausoleums with that beer connection. But then there's also that little bit of a journey off the pathway that only we can to take you to where Adam Lemp is laid to rest, and Samuel Wainwright is laid to rest, and we can even find the Urics for you as well.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening to the podcast, and please share this episode with your family and friends. If you got value from the episode as well as the podcast, you can do it right from the platform you are listening on. Take a screenshot and tag us and tag yourself. We are at Podcast Can You Dig It on Instagram.